Hello everyone, welcome to International Politics Forum webinar, and this meeting will be start on five minutes again. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to International Politics Forum webinar, and this webinar will be held 2 minutes again. And we hope we hope you enjoy this webinar and get many benefits from this webinar. Okay, good afternoon, greetings to all of us. Good afternoon, everyone. Uh, good afternoon, Mr. Tamila Tasheva.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for
good morning, actually.
Morning in Crimea, of course. I would like to thank you to joining this webinar and participating. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, Mrs. Suyani Indriastuti.
Good afternoon, everyone, and nice to meet you, Mrs. Tamila Tasheva. Nice to meet you and all of you.
Nice to meet you.
Okay. To the Honorable His Excellency, Mrs. Tamila Tasheva, as permanent representative of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, and Mrs. Suyani Indriastuti, PhD, as the International Relations Lecturer of University of Jember. Also to our beloved participants. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Muhammad Saifullah Arif. I'm here as moderator and also the communication officer for International Politics Forum. Before we start our main event, I will read the rules. Consist of the first, participants must activate the camera feature. Second, participants are not allowed to activate the microphone during the presentation. Third, participants are not allowed to scribble the share screen. Fourth, participants can deliver questions in question answer session using raise hand feature and format like full name, also institution, followed by the question. And the last, participants are not allowed to create any chaos or provoke. Our next agenda is Now we are going to the core of the webinar, which is the presentation by His Excellency Mrs. Tamila Tasheva. Mrs. Tamila Tasheva. Now the time is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Dear colleagues, thank you for organizing this event and inviting me. Recently, I had the pleasure to visit Indonesia as a part of my working trip to the Southeastern Asia. We had insightful and fruitful meetings with the representatives of the parliament, government, civil society, religious organization, and media that supported our understanding that we should work more with the global South. In particular, such an important player as Indonesia, especially in the context of the Indonesia's chairmanship of the ASEAN. Currently, I am a permanent representative of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, and Crimea is a place where the war has actually started in 2014 when the peninsula was occupied. Since 2014, our office has been operating from the mainland of Ukraine. And for instance, I myself cannot travel, unfortunately, to my home Crimea because I will be immediately arrested like many other my compatriots. After 2014, Russia has turned Crimea into isolated military base. All fundamental human rights are violated there, including the rights of indigenous people of Crimean Tatar Muslim community especially. As of March 9, 2023, 181 citizens of Ukraine from Crimea are illegally imprisoned for political motives in the temporary occupied peninsula or in Russia. 116 of them are Crimean Tatar. As of February 9, 2023, 220 children of political prisoners, mostly children from Crimean Tatar families, have been left without father's care. More than 1 year ago, when a full-scale Russian invasion started, Crimea became a springboard for the attack. All the civilian infrastructure that Russia advertised as a success, like the Kerch Bridge, for example, or the Tavrida Highway, was turned into a military infrastructure and began to serve for the transportation of Russian occupiers and weapons, which takes the lives of hundreds of Ukrainians every day. After 24 February 2022, the situation with human rights and civil rights in Crimea has become even worse. For instance, the mobilization that started in September last year especially targeted the Crimean Tatar Muslim community. Unfortunately, it is not the first time that Crimean Tatars are facing oppression from the side of Moscow. Here, I would like to give you very brief information on the Crimean history without going much into detail, of course, but it's important to understand that Crimean Tatars is indigenous people that were formed in the peninsula. They had their own state which was eliminated by Russian Empire Catherine II in 1783, and that is the point when Russia started to colonize Crimea for the first time. As a result, the percentages of Crimean Tatars went down from around 95% to 30%. After that was another huge wave of colonization in Soviet time. In 1944, the Soviet authorities deported Crimean Tatars and representatives of another national minorities, Greeks, for example, Armenians, Bulgarians, and Germans, and sought to completely erase the memory of Crimea history and turned into a peninsula of Russian wartime glory. This deportation took the life of between 1/3 and 1/2 of Crimean Tatar population, and left Crimea demographically and economically wounded and without any Crimean Tatar population. And that at that moment, Crimea became a place with a Russian population majority. And that took them dozens of years to go back home to Crimea, and my family also. And the USSR had to collapse to that. That is why Crimean Tatars don't want to flee Crimea, even in the midst of repression, and oppose the new wave of the Russian colonization. In the light of this context, the international armed conflict that takes place in Ukraine now, which we and the democratic world defines as the Russian aggression against Ukraine, is indeed endless because it lasts for centuries. Now Russia tries to colonize not only Crimea, but the wild Ukraine, and does not even hide this intention. Russia tries to eliminate Crimean Tatars, Ukrainians, destroyed our culture, rewrite our history, and turned not only Crimea, but the wild Ukraine into a military base for the further war against other countries. Russia sees Ukraine, in particular Crimea, only as the missing piece of the empire. And to bring an end to this war, which is also in the headline of this event, it is possible. First and foremost, we are supplying Ukraine with weapons, but not only. Political support and humanitarian aid are extremely important. We are grateful to the Republic of Indonesia for its support of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, in particular for its clear position within the UN General Assembly. We are also thankful for the government of the Republic of Indonesia, private enterprises, and ordinary citizens for the assistance provided to Ukraine in overcoming the humanitarian crisis caused by the full-scale Russian aggression. Continued support from Indonesia as a regional leader and global player is very important for Ukraine, of course. We especially appreciate the visit of the President of the Republic of Indonesia, Joko Widodo, to Ukraine after the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion in June 2022. We understand the statement towards the idea of peace. Ukraine absolutely supports the idea of peace, and it is worth reminding that peace will be possible only when Ukraine wins, especially for Crimea and for the Crimean Tatar people. And for us, it is important to convey this message to wild democratic world, including Indonesia. Ukraine victory should not be a polarizing issue. It is a unifying issue because of the values, but also out of the practical reasons related to the security, military security, food security, human security. We are confident that everyone will benefit from Ukraine victory, not only Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, and the West, but also Indonesians and those people that live in the Russian Federation and were colonized by Moscow in the previous centuries. Many thanks for attention.
Okay, thank you for Mrs. Tamila Tasheva for very clear, very insightful speaks from Mrs. Tamila Tasheva. Now, I think it's the time to move to the second speaker, Mrs. Suyani Indriastuti, PhD, for IR lecturer in Jember. Now the time is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, moderator, for giving me opportunity to share my knowledge about Ukraine and Russian war. Her Excellency Mrs. Tamila Tasheva already talked about the practical aspect in Ukraine. Me as a lecturer, I would like to speak from the perspective of international relations theory, international relations studies. Please let me share the PowerPoint. Okay, the main case I would like to talk in this today's webinar is about rethinking or questioning international relations theory, especially liberalism. As we know that conflict in Ukraine we can call as a protracted conflict, as it has not been solved until now. And yeah, the escalation of the conflict have not been I mean, the conflict has not finished yet. So this is like become the main problem also in the international relations theory, as we know that we already developed for theories such as liberalism and also realisms, and it caused debates in the international relations theory. So I would like to start with the background of the conflict. What actually happened from the perspective of international relation theory. There are several aspects I can identify, but we can add the others later. At least we can see there is a Russian defensivism about the program or the I mean, the Russia want to go back to Russian Empire, so that they want to enlarge their power or influence in the neighboring countries. They want to go back to the Russian Empire or the former Soviet Union. And then the other one is it also relates to the NATO expansion, yeah, because there is even though Cold War already finished since 1990s, in the early 1990s, but still the international politics, we cannot ignore that there's rivalries between, and also the NATO program to expand in the world. And then the other one is also about the EU expansion. As we know that the enlargement of EU already happened. The previous one is only in the West Europe, and then they expand to the other part of Europe. So there is like rivalry between the hegemon in Europe. And then the other one is also the pro-democracy promotion. Yeah, it's related to the idea about liberalism as well, but how liberalism can be accepted by the universal governments, and including the democracy. But the thing is, in the perspective of international relations, what happened actually, we can go back, or we can look back at the great debates in international relations. We can see the first great debate in international relations is between realism and liberalism. Realism focus on power and the national interest and national survival, military power, and the idea of a zero-sum game in international politics. And state of nature is central assumption. As I mean, the thinking that state is a unitary actor and state aims to promote their national interests in the world that is anarchy. So in realism, the government or the state can expand their territory maybe, or their power to their national interests. On the other hand, liberalism seeks optimistic perspective about how peace can be achieved through international interdependence by the economic activities, and how economic interdependence could minimize military conflict and tend to realize international peace. That's the main debate between realism and liberalism. What the interest one is that we can go back to the statement about the end of history proposed by Fukuyama. It was occurred during the end of the Cold War, that the end of the Cold War marks the triumph of capitalism and liberalism. So what happened in international relations studies, it means that liberalisms have a higher place, or have a perspective that can be accepted by the global world. Yeah. But what happened in Ukraine and Russian war show that there is a problem in liberalism itself. So we can think that every ideas or ideologies, it can last long, because there might be a problem that occurred in international relations. For instance, Russian and Ukraine war showed that liberalism cannot be take for granted. I mean, there is a problem that we can criticize liberalism. And then regarding the economic aspect of the or the economic impact of Russian and Ukraine wars, we can see that liberalism believes that economic interdependence lead to peace. It means that any activities that show interdependence can bring benefits for all the parties in the activity. But what happened? Because of the Russians and Ukraine war, we can see that interdependence also have a negative side. For example, about once there crisis happen or conflict happen, like what happened in Ukraine and Russian war, it affect the global value chains, and it leads to vulnerability about the food availability, for example, or energy availability. That's why we can question about the idea of interdependence itself. We can see that Russians and Ukraine's value regarding the economic or global value chains. Ukraine's top export was agricultural products, as about 46%, correct me if I'm wrong, followed by manufacturers, about 42%. And Ukraine's primary export destination is in Europe Unions, and then China, Turkey, and Russia, and other countries. And Russia top export is in energy product, metals, and then machinery and equipment, and other chemical products. due to the war, there is a problem in global value chains because there is a decrease in production and also export of agricultural product that lead to the scarcity of grain and the increase of the agricultural product price. For example, because of the disruption of global value chain of Ukraine's agricultural product, it leads to the increase of the price, and then it affects the availability of the commodities, and then it affects or it leads to the vulnerability of particular society. For instance, in some countries in Africa and also Indonesia also impacted by the disruption of global value chain. So in conclusion, we can say that we are from international relations study, we have to think or rethink about the international relations theory, especially about the liberalism and then interdependence economic that leads to peace. Thank you.
Okay, very clear, very insightful from Mrs. Suyani Indriastuti for University of Jember. Now, maybe I would like to ask to Mrs. Tamila Tasheva about the situations, the newest situations in Ukraine, especially Crimea. I think it's cruel, but I would like to ask you about how should international society do, how should international society act with this endless conflict between Russia and Ukraine? And can you tell me, can you describe to us where's the newest situations in there? Are there's a cruel or nah, somebody else? Okay.
Thank you for your question. Situation, of course, it's not good because we live at everyday war, actually. Yesterday we have 4 hours of alarm when we have the territory of all Ukraine missile attacks from Russian side. Unfortunately, we have every day when everyday people is dying in Ukraine, in mainland of Ukraine, especially, of course, in every city. We have a situation in temporary occupied territories, newly occupied territories, where people are kidnapping or people are killing from Russian armed forces, and actually Russia used the same playbook on these newly occupied territories in Kherson region, for example, or Zaporizhia region, for persecution of people. For example, when full-scale invasion is started at 24th of February, and when Russian armed forces occupied Kherson region and city of Kherson, they start to kidnap people from their houses, torture them, and illegally transferring those people to another occupied territories, and then to Russia. For example, they transferred our population, and it's really thousands of people from Kherson and Zaporizhia region or from Mariupol region. As you maybe know, yesterday we have a decision from International Criminal Court about Mr. Putin and Ms. And ombudswoman, children ombudswoman from Russia, and they International Criminal Court ordered for immediately arrest for Mr. Putin, and it must be do it in 123 countries who are members of Rome Statute. Yes, and it's actually a very important decision of International Criminal Court. We applied to International Criminal Court during 9 years of occupation of Crimea and 9 years of this war. And episode why actually International Criminal Court do this decision. One of the episodes, it's kidnapping and illegally transferring children from Ukraine to Russian Federation and illegally adopting all these children. And actually, unfortunately, we have a really terrible situation with our children in Ukraine also. If we say precisely about situation in Crimea, I mentioned it in my statement. Situation in Crimea even worse after a full-scale invasion, which is started at 24th February last year. Russia used a newly established legislation against our Ukrainian citizens in Crimea. It's Article 20.3.3. It's discrediting of armed forces of Russian Federation, and they used this article of administrative law of Russia against our people to persecute our people. At this moment, we have 273 cases of such kind of politically motivated persecution of our Ukrainian activists. And what actually do our activists in Crimea and why they persecute by Russia? For example, they stay on the square with a list of paper and no war, for example, on it, yes? Or they sing or playing Ukrainian songs on the weddings, for example. Червона Калина is one of the most popular songs in Ukraine. Or they share some leaflets against this war, which is started by Russia, yes. And it's hundreds of people. Only what we now from a court decisions in Crimea, but of course it's even more in Crimea. They turned all Crimea to a military base. I mentioned it also, and they mobilized our people. Of course, it's a very difficult situation for especially Crimean Tatar Muslim community, because they start to flee Crimea after mobilization processes. But also Russian occupiers understand that in Crimea they must to flee Crimea at some moment, of course, after our victory, after liberation of Crimea, and they feel prepared for this process. Many of Russian occupiers or their families start to flee Crimea. Last few or 6 months, actually. Yes, and but if we say about all Ukraine, in Kyiv, where I live and operate from Kyiv, situation is more or less normal, but not. I don't say that it's actually safety, yes, because I mentioned it that yesterday actually we have 4 hours attack, missile attack against Kyiv and Kyiv Oblast. Of course, situation in Kherson, for example, is worse because Ukraine now control city of Kherson, and that small cities or regions which are very close to Kherson, but left side of Kherson region is controlled by Russians, and they at every day attack another right bank of river of Dnipro, and Kherson is on the attack from missile, not missiles actually, but attack from different types of weapon from left banks of river Dnipro. Also, situation in Kharkiv region, for example, is also not very good, and it's everyday attacks from Russia, or, for example, especially Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, which are controlled by Ukraine. Unfortunately, it's the thousands of people who are dying, and we understand that we, of course, need for support from international our partners, and of course, we understand the position of these balances of Indonesia, but for example, Southeastern Asia countries could give us a humanitarian support, for example, yes, for our people who are struggling, or who are start to flee in country, or inside its internal displaced persons, or who are displaced abroad of Ukraine. Of course, from Western partners, we ask more weapons, because we understand that to stop this war, we don't to stop this war and all these killings of people and destroying our infrastructure, we actually need more weapons to stop this war. It's because if we stand up this our people and our military forces, even if our Western partners don't give us a weapon, we continue our resist. And if we don't have enough weapons for fighting against enemy, we have more victims of this war. Yes, and this international war conflict are continued. It's not mean that we are stop and war is also are finished. No, for Ukraine, of course, victory. It's occupying all our territories, including Crimea, and and of course it's very difficult to communicate with Russia, because they say it's our territory and we don't give back this territory. For Ukraine, it's not only because of territory; it's because of people. And I mentioned about Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, our Ukrainian citizens who are suffering in Crimea.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Tamila Tasheva. We hope that everything will be clear in Ukraine and Crimea, as everything will be okay, and international society gives a punishment to Russia. Maybe it's time to Q&A for everyone who want to ask Mrs. Tamila Tasheva or Mrs. Suyani Indriastuti. You can raise hand and ask. Maybe even and if you can raise hand and on cam, you can type on the chat box. Hello everyone. With this Q&A session are open. Okay, there are two questions in chat box. I will read it for, and the first question is Mrs. Suyani. I have a question for Mrs. Suyani. What should Indonesia do in Ukraine-Russia conflict? How far Indonesia can be intervention in this conflict? Also, question for Mrs. Tasheva. What effect from this conflict in Europe regional, especially economic, and why Ukraine leader did not search supporting from Asia country? Okay, thank you.
Okay, is it my turn to answer the questions?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Thank you. First of all, I would like to say very sorry about what happened in the Ukraine, and we do hope that the people of Ukraine have support from international society and have the freedom, and also the conflict can be solved soon. Regarding the questions about what should Indonesia do in responding the Ukraine and Russia conflict, how far Indonesia can intervene in this conflict. Okay, to answer the question, let's go back to the Indonesian vision about non-alignment movement. We remember that since President Sukarno era and also the Vice President Pak Muhammad Hatta, we developed a vision, namely non-alignment movement. It was issued or introduced during the Cold War era, but I think it's still relevant during the current era, especially related to the conflict like what happened in Ukraine and Russia. We do support that international peace, like what written in Indonesian Constitution. The most important aspect in Indonesian Constitution about international relations is Indonesia support the achievement of international peace, so that Indonesia also have responsibility about the resolution about Russian and Ukraine war. So what should we do? I think as far as I know, and from the back to the Indonesian vision, and also Indonesian Constitution, Indonesia supports the human rights, and we help, or we aims to have a mediation between Ukraine and Russia in order to the conflict can be solved soon. But it doesn't mean that we ignore about the human rights problem. I think Indonesian government support and also would help the will place the human problem, the human rights, and also how the victims get their freedom, and also their needs is fulfilled. I'm not from the government institution. I'm from lecture, so I'm talking not as a Indonesian, what I'm talking is not Indonesian policy, but I'm talking as Indonesian people, and also a lecturer that believe about Indonesian vision on international or foreign policy, Indonesian foreign policy. So how far we can involved in Russian and Ukraine war, maybe we can support a mediation, and also giving aid or others to support human rights. Thank you. That's all.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Suyani Indriastuti. Now let's move to the second questions. Okay, I want to ask Mrs. Suyani, and maybe it is a question for Mrs. Tamila. So, can the Ukraine-Russia conflict lead to the World War III? Okay, thank you.
Okay. Mrs. Tamila first, maybe?
As I understand, a question about the influence Russian war against Ukraine, how it's influenced to countries, and why Asian countries help or not help for Ukraine, as I understand. Actually, many Asian countries really help for Ukraine, but on humanitarian sphere, yes. Some countries, for example, Japan, they support Ukraine as financially support and for political support. Of course, we have support from countries from South in Eastern Asia and Indonesia, particular on level of UNJ, when Indonesia voted on the resolution on UN General Assembly, and it, of course, it's very important, and it's a very important political support. And visit of President of Indonesia to Kiev, to Ukraine last year. It's first visit of President from your region to Ukraine during full-scale invasion, and it's really very strong signal for Ukraine and Ukrainian society, and of course for another regions also. But I maybe also say a few words about issue of colonial this anti-colonial war, because for Ukraine it's really anti-colonial and existential war. because Russia during years actually says that Russia is an anti-imperial power, but it's actually not true. Yes, and professor actually mentioned that in his statement, also at the beginning of his statement, because Russia tried to restore actually empire, Soviet empire in our region, and why Russia attacked and start this unprovoked war against Ukraine. It's because we start to raise all issue with anti-colonial past, and we decide our way for Ukraine with our values, with values of freedom, with values of human rights. And this concept of freedom, anti-colonialism, and anti-imperialism is very important for us, and as I understand, very important for Indonesia. And your concept, which is mentioned in Constitution, Merdeka, and which is in your anthem of Indonesia about Merdeka, it's also important. And actually, it's very related to Ukraine. And we also have our concept of Merdeka, concept of freedom, свободы, in our anthem also, and in our constitution. Yes, and as I understand, this concept is written in the Indonesian constitution, and where there is a fundamental condemnation of colonialism and imperialism, and very important to explain the history of this war, yes, which is started not actually even 9 years ago, but before, because during the century, Russia tried to vanish all diversity in our region, in Ukraine, in Crimea, particular, for example. And for Ukraine, very important to work and communicate with Southeastern Asia. And we understand that we also do a lot of mistakes. I explain which mistakes. We do not have really deep communication and cooperation with your region, yes. And during 30 years of our independence, we communicate, we have some economical cooperation, of course, some political cooperation, but we don't have maybe many resources also for have this deeper communication and collaboration with countries from your region, and precisely with Indonesia. And we work now on our mistakes. And as the President Zelensky mentioned last year, that our international policy, and we must start and review and restart actually this communication with Southeastern Asia countries, with Malaysia, Indonesia, with India also, of course, to explain this war, and to give, of course, some benefit for countries from your region also. And it's a two-way road from Ukraine side and from countries from Southeastern Asia also. We need this cooperation, and we start to rebuild our communication, our collaboration, and that is why we have our visit in Indonesia and in Malaysia to communicate, to explain what has happened in Ukraine, which help we need, and what we could do and give to our partners.
Okay, very clear now. The answer from Mrs. Suyani Indriastuti. Do you have any thoughts on these questions?
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I would like to answer the question from Ms. Himaziana about the possibility Russian and Ukraine war lead to World War III. Well, it's depend. I mean, if during the situation, I don't think that the Ukraine and Russian war would lead to World War III, because so many countries concerned about the conflict, and the escalation of a conflict occurred in only in Russia and Ukraine, while World War II, it should be larger than that. So if the international societies, the government, and also the international organization concerned on the mediation and also concerned on the conflict resolution, so I don't think that it would lead to World War III. But if then there is conflict escalation, especially because there is a rivalry between the country, and also the conflict escalation, so that it could be go to World War III. But from now, I don't think so. And then the next one is about the effect of the world. Okay, so impact of Ukraine and Russian conflict on the world. Okay, one impact that can we see now is about the economic impact of the conflict or the war. As I said before, the conflict disrupt the global value chains about agricultural products and manufacturers and other economic export and import. There's a problem in production and also the problem of distribution due to the conflict. So yes, what impacts of the world? Yes, that's the availability of raw material of agriculture for particular countries that would lead to vulnerability, the scarcity of food. So that, yes, every country has to anticipate about the impact of the war. And then the next one is from Mrs. Sriwartini. It's about possibilities to settle the dispute, and also what kind of efforts we can do to solve the conflict. Well, again, if I think so many efforts already implement, like economic sanction and other sanctions imposed by the European Union to Russia. It is an effort to make Russia stop the war, and also yes, I mean, to reduce the conflict escalation. But until now, even though it's already 10 package of sanction, the conflict not yet solved. So I think what the effort should have be implement, I think, is we optimize the international society to one of the to make public to influence public perspective, or maybe we can show about the impacts, or about the conflict, the impacts of conflict on humanity, so that people can support the conflict resolutions. And the most important is, I think, is the role of the United Nations. We can optimize the role of United Nations, because I think that's the international organizations that have a high influence both in Russia and also in Ukraine. So maybe that's one of the efforts can be implemented. And then it's from Adinda about EU sanction. Okay, EU sanctions to Russia. Okay, the effectiveness of sanction, it's depend on the level of dependence of the country to the country that gives the sanction. So until now, it's already 10 package, but still it doesn't affect Russia effectively, because Russia think that there is a dependence from EU, especially from energy resources from Russia. But what EU sanctions implement to Russia, I think, is a good effort. I mean, at least that's will limit the activity of the Russia, and also have like threat to Russia, especially if it is related to the availability of basic needs of the people. But again, it's depend on the government, the extent to which the government concerned about the freedom of the society and the fulfillment of the basic needs of the society. I think that's all from me.
Okay, thank you. The answer from Mrs. Tamila Tasheva and Mrs. Suyani Indriastuti. Very insightful, very clear. Now let's move to the third questions from Adrian Ragaswara, who raised his hand. Now time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Moderator. Is my voice clear enough? Sorry.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Thank you for the opportunity. First of all, as a international society, maybe I would like to give my deep condolence for the Ukraine people, the Crimean people, and all of the people who have been impacted by this war. Okay, thank you very much. Next, I would like to ask about the military dispute in this Crimea. From my little knowledge about the Crimea dispute, this military dispute is about the Crimea territorial war. They fighting about the right about Crimea, right? So from your perspective, did the Crimea have has their own military, or is it a land that hasn't any right of authority from Russia or Ukraine, like an independent nation, or is it still undisputed area that still Ukraine and Russia fighting for, like that? And my second is about the future of the Crimea here. What will what will Crimea help for the future? Like, is this area or land will be an independent, or will be the part of Ukraine here, or like what? So maybe that's all my question that to be answered from both of our respected speaker here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. As I understand, it's about Crimea. It's for me also a question. Actually, I mentioned it a few times. Crimea, it's a springboard for offensive operation against Ukraine. And during this 9 years of occupation, which started in 2014, Russia prepared this full-scale invasion against Ukraine. And one of the reasons, and maybe most reason why Russia started this invasion last year, full-scale invasion, is because we don't have enough attention and a strong reaction in 2014 when Crimea is occupied by Russia. It's not strong reaction. Of course, we have a sanction regime against Russia. We have a political support on the level of the UNG with resolutions. But it's not enough, yes, during these 9 years. And during 9 years or 8 years, Russia prepared this full-scale invasion, of course, and used Crimea as a military base. During 9 years of occupation in Crimea, Russians established or do 16 conscription campaigns, and they conscript 39,000 of people to Russian army. According to our information, in Crimea we have of course, it's the Russian military forces and the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, for example, yes, from which also we have this hundreds of missile attacks. Even now, we have an alarm in Kiev region. They do this missile attacks all over the Ukraine's territory. And according to our information, in regular time, before full-scale invasion, in Crimea we have 32,000 Russian soldiers. And in wartime, when Russia start this invasion, plus 10,000 Russian soldiers. It's near 50 thousand soldiers, which we have in Crimea, Russian soldiers, during last year. They somehow moved or Russia or to occupied territories in Kherson or Zaporizhia, some part of this military staff, but in regular time we have near 42 or 45,000 of Russian soldiers in Crimea. And of course, it's very important to mention it that influence of these Russian soldiers and this military base in Crimea on all Ukrainian citizens in Crimea. They persecute, I mentioned it, Crimean Tatars or Ukrainians in Crimea, Muslim community in Crimea, and for Russia, they don't need any diversity in Crimea. That is why they vanish and clean up Crimea from unloyal population, and especially Crimean Tatars. And really during centuries, and if we and I mentioned about history of Crimea, Crimean Tatars state, Crimean Khanate. During this historical period, Crimean Tatars have a strong position in Crimea, but after 1944, when Crimean Tatars are deported, Russian citizens or Russians start a majority population in Crimea, and of course very difficult but we must say that we have international law, international recognized borders, and according to international law, international recognized border, Crimea is a part of Ukraine, and if we start to communicate about which is territory, Russia or Ukraine, no, we have international recognized border, international law, and any countries could not do a violation of international law, yes, and international recognized borders. Crimean Tatars, of course, it's a indigenous population of Ukraine, and very important to mention that Crimean Tatars are recognized in Ukraine as the indigenous population of Ukraine, and it's only one ethnical minority in Ukraine which could get in maybe future territorial autonomy in Crimea, but in borders of Ukraine. We don't think that Crimea could have independent state, not. It's a Ukrainian state, and Crimean Tatar, the indigenous population, is support territorial integrity of Ukraine, and many Crimean Tatars now is fighting fighting on Ukrainian side in our Ukrainian military forces, fight against Russian enemy, and fight about the occupation of Crimea, about territorial integrity of Ukraine, and Crimean Tatars the measures of Crimean Tatars. All Crimean Tatars stay on the really strong position about territorial integrity of Ukraine, and it's only one way to stop this, to finish this war, is the occupation of Crimea, the occupation another regions of Crimea, because it's also issue of security issue, because if we don't deoccupy Crimea and stand only on the border, which is occupied after 24th of February 2022, we unfortunately in the nearest future, Russia start another invasion, and that is why we need to push out and go out Russian soldiers and Russian Black Sea Fleet from Crimea, because it's really security for all our region, and actually region of global South, because Russia control Black Sea and Azov region, and all these I'm sorry, all these ships with grain for Middle East countries, for African countries, for Southeastern Asia is blocked also in Black Sea from Russian side. Of course, we have this green deal with Russia and UN and Turkey, Turk Republic. But even now in the Black Sea, we have a lot of ships with grain, which is now blocked in this region. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Tamila Tasheva, for the answer. Now, thank you for two honorable speaker, Her Excellency Mrs. Tamila Tasheva and Mrs. Suyani Indriastuti. Very insightful material, very understanding, and finally we come to the end of the session. And before we leave this meeting, we would like to invite you to the photo sessions, and prepare yourself to open your camera for the participants and Mrs. Tamila Tasheva and Mrs. Suyani Indriastuti. Okay.